Hi, I'm Urmi Desai, editor of MoveSmartly.com, and this is a Move Smartly show. In this week's episode, my colleague and co-host John Pasalis and I are going to do one of our Move Smartly idea sessions, where we take a deeper look into the bigger ideas in real estate that underpin the market realities that we face today. Today, John and I are going to be talking about what John calls the politics of housing. The idea being that while we spend a lot of time talking about real estate as if it's just a problem of supply and demand to be solved, that is just a matter of economic planning, there is a much deeper reality that actually how we view housing politically, who should have the right to it and under what conditions, has an impact on shaping the very economic questions that we're trying to answer, and indeed some of the economic questions that we don't even think to ask at all. So before we get started, as always, I want to encourage you that if you do find this show interesting and informative, please like, share, or leave a positive review wherever you're watching or listening to us from. We really appreciate your support. And with that being said, on to the show. So today is an idea sesh. Are you ready?
I'm ready to go. Looking forward to the discussion.
You're All right. So, John, something you've been thinking a lot about lately
Mhm.
is this idea that seeing homes as just being a problem of supply and demand is in itself a problem. What
Yeah.
do you mean by that?
Um, so yeah, I mean, I think for years we've been hearing these narratives about, the problem with housing is about basic economics, just supply and demand, economists and politicians talking about them like they're little widgets in a factory. We just pull a lever and increase supply and all of our problems are going to be solved. But housing's quite different. I mean, it's not a commodity. It's not a widget in a factory. I mean, there are, of course, two things that make it fundamentally different. And these differences impact the relationship between supply, demand, and prices. And the first, of course, is that unlike widgets in a factory, houses, shelter is a human necessity, right? So unlike other goods, when the price of another good goes up, traditional supply demand economics tells us the demand goes down, right? But with houses, as house prices increase, as rents increase, the demand for shelter doesn't fall. The demand for shelter is what it is. It's a function of demographic changes, population growth, all of those factors. So the demand for shelter and housing doesn't decline. People just end up living in deplorable conditions potentially or get pushed to homelessness. So, this is a fundamental difference that I think is kind of overlooked when we just talk about homes like they're just commodities, right? And the other, of course, important difference is that unlike most other durable goods, commodities, or consumable goods, like houses are a financial investment, right? They are a financial asset that most people expect will increase over time. Similarly, when we think about the relationship between prices and demand, typically as prices increase, we expect demands to fall, right? Well, why didn't demand plummet, at the start of COVID when everyone started rushing the market? Or in Toronto in 2016, 2017, when we saw this rapid increase in prices, demand didn't plummet. Demand actually increased. And demand increased because people saw homes as a lucrative investment and they wanted a piece of that and they wanted to buy into that, right? So again, it's not as simple as just talking about houses like basic supply and demand. I mean, those relationships don't hold up as well over time, and they're misleading. And I think partly we're kind of led to part of the problems we've had in Canada that they're using basic economics to describe something that's a little bit more complex, and in fact, probably taking advantage of that by making it such a simple issue, in kind of media headlines.
So, I do take your point that it's a more in demand good, and one for which, as you point out, demand doesn't fall when prices go up. So, and that's I suppose the human necessity part of it, and that necessity is both physical security and also psychological security. It's, after all, housing is part of that hierarchy of human needs.
Mm-hmm.
So that part is pretty clear. And I get that it's a financial asset, so it's one that people are interested in and having and holding. But does that really make it something that's not a supply and demand problem, or does that just make it a more complex supply and problem? Like, what are different ways in which this complexity makes it the supply and demand equation not work like you would expect it to?
Well, I mean, I think if we just look at the past 5 years in Canada, right? The past 5 years in Canada, largely, our population boomed. Canada was growing by 300 or 350,000 people per year, and that peaked at 1.3 million, right? And every Canadian knows the narrative that every politician was telling us, and virtually every housing expert was telling us was that our crazy house prices and the booming price and rents and home prices was not really about the demand for housing. It was a supply problem, right? And this is the narrative that we heard for years, that we just need to build more homes and gatekeepers need to get out of the way and we just need to build more housing. And again, when you think about housing as just a supply demand problem, maybe people bought that narrative for years. But the challenge, of course, is that you cannot triple the supply of housing overnight. It is not the type of product that you can just pull a lever and flood the market with supply to take pressure off home prices, but this misleading narrative was the narrative that dominated the headlines for years. And not a lot of people questioned it because, well, the economists told us that, and our politicians told us it's just a supply problem, and of course, that made our crisis even worse until it just hit this breaking point last year when our federal government said, well, maybe we got it wrong. Maybe we need to line up Canada's population growth with housing completions because, growing by 1.3 million people per year isn't sustainable. So, yeah, it has a huge impact. I think it's part of the reason why housing became so unaffordable in Canada.
Yeah, I can take your point. I see what you're saying. Like, we would see official reports from CMHC, our federal housing agency, saying if we build 3.5 million homes, or if we build this for Ontario, or if we build this for Canada as a whole, we will be able to meet the supply for everyone that's looking for a home at affordability, which was defined as what, 30% of
Household
gross
income, I
income.
think. Yeah.
Yeah. So I can see how you're saying it. Most Canadians bought into that. We were almost primed to think that we just needed to keep our eye on how many houses were being built. So I
Exactly.
do take your point that there's that, but the problem is that the supply is inelastic when it comes to housing. An economist would describe inelastic supply as something that can't really be ramped up
Hmm.
very easily if demand goes up.
Hmm.
And that's what you're pointing out. So sure, some of those projections had us thinking about the problem incorrectly, but does it really take it out of the realm of economics? Isn't this just maybe not as straightforward to solve, but the problem of inelastic supply, which economists and experts would argue you can solve by making the supply of housing more elastic, like you said, removing gatekeepers, doing all the things so that we could see more housing go up, maybe allow multiple dwellings on land. Why wouldn't that work then?
I mean, this is the story I think economists and housing supply advocates have been selling for years, that if you just remove the barriers, there's really no limit to the number of homes a city and a province and a country can build, right? The challenge, of course, is like that these ideas don't really hold up so well. Like the theory is that if you just make housing elastic, builders can just rapidly increase the supply in response to demand shock, and home prices don't appreciate. They just appreciate at the rate of inflation or the rate of the inflation of construction costs. And a lot of these ideas, originally were kind of written, I'd say 20 years ago, like in the economic literature. And a lot of the cities that economists were looking at back then, maybe had elastic housing markets and had markets that actually didn't appreciate very much. States like Georgia and in particular Texas. Texas was one of these examples of states and municipalities that allow builders to build, and home prices didn't appreciate much. And they actually didn't appreciate much in the years leading up to the U.S. financial crisis. They underperformed the national average. But if you look at many of those cities and states since then, in particular, Texas and the cities in there, prices have skyrocketed. And not only they skyrocketed in Texas, they have increased far more rapidly than the national average, right? And not only are they increasing faster than the national average, if you look at where institutional investors are buying, so these are the big corporate hedge funds who are buying up hundreds of thousands of homes in the US. Many of them are buying in those very states, in Georgia and in Texas, in the states that in theory should be terrible investments because builders can build, 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 are the states where these institutional investors are actually the most dominant and buying up the higher share of homes than in any other state. So there's a massive disconnect between what the experts tell us should happen and what actually is happening. The experts tell us Texas home prices should not appreciate very much because builders or cities allow builders to build, build, build. Home prices should be a terrible investment because home prices shouldn't appreciate because we allow so much building in Texas. And the opposite is happening, right? So again, there's a massive disconnect between what the economists are telling us is the way the world should work versus the way the world is actually working. And, again, I think, when you think about how do you make decisions and understand the market, listen, Wall Street's doing something very different from what the halls of Harvard are telling us should be happening. So Wall Street's evolving faster than academia. And I think as a consumer, as someone who's in the industry, you want to pay attention to where the money's going and what is actually happening rather than these academic utopias that the professors tell us should happen. And I think that's something we need to be mindful of.
So you're making me think of two responses to what you've
Sure.
just said. So before we return to the Texas example, I want to come back to the CMHC estimates on how many houses Canada would need to make it affordable. It's one thing if you're building houses in a market that is affordable to start, like Texas, and you're selling them at that point and growing your supply. But in the case of Ontario, at least, I think the paper said it would need a 38% reduction in home prices in Ontario. You would have to have so much supply that the demand would be met at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And that would result in a 38% fall in home
Mm-hmm.
prices.
Mm-hmm.
That leads me to point out another issue, which is that could we really expect suppliers to behave in this really neutral way? Oh, prices are falling. I'll just stop, keep building at lower and lower prices. We have a case right now in Ontario where all new construction has come to an absolute standstill,
Mm-hmm.
right? Before seeing prices drop.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a decision to try and hold on until situation improves. So
Mm-hmm.
I guess I have two observations. One, let's get back to where is all this new demand coming from?
Mm-hmm.
But before we get there, how would we even expect supply to catch up if it means a fall in prices,
Well, you
even according
can't.
to the classical
Yeah,
economic formula? Like
100% you
even if I
can't.
bought it.
Yeah, you can't. I mean, that's the problem. When CMHC came out with the report that Canada needs to triple the number of homes it builds, everyone kind of jumped on that and said, yes, this is a solution. We're just going to triple housing completions. What was missed, as you said, was this theory was that the supply would triple in an environment of falling home prices. Builders do not increase the supply in an environment in falling home prices. Home prices have been flat and supply has stopped in Ontario for the most part, new supply. The only place where we're building more, provinces like Alberta, where home prices are actually rising, right?
Mhm.
So again, this is a disconnect between the way maybe CMHC's economists think the world works, that the builders just want to flood the market and make homes affordable for us all in an environment of falling home prices, versus what actually happens, which is builders need home prices to stay at least at the level they are, if not increasing. So yeah, you cannot expect the private sector to flood the market with supply to make houses more affordable for us all. It's the builders want the highest price possible for the good that they're selling. They're a business at the end of the day.
So let's go back to the example of provinces like Alberta and maybe
Mm-hmm.
states like Texas, where you're starting from a lower starting price point and homes start getting built. But as more and more supply floods the market, prices don't fall as expected.
Hmm.
We haven't seen this in Alberta yet, but in Texas example, you've pointed out, the prices start to get more and more expensive. Now, I'm wondering why that is. Is it something to do with the nature of housing as a good? Like it's not very substitutable, meaning all the demand crowds around fewer choices. So, for example, if I'm buying clothing or cars,
Hmm.
I can go from the high end car to the mid price car to the lower car to the used car
Hmm.
to my foot if I had to.
Hmm.
But at some point, when it comes to housing, there's just not as much choice. And at the end of that chain is homelessness. So
Hmm.
it's not a very substitutable good. Is that why any demand in the market just starts crowding over any increase in supply?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. I mean, certainly at one point, you're right. It's not substitutable. If you're at the most affordable segment of the market, it's not substitutable. At some point, you have to get into these different types of living situations where you're co-living or renting rooms or homeless. You're right. At some point, there you cannot go more affordable when it comes to housing. And in the Toronto area, that's what we're seeing. Like rents are unaffordable, which is, if you're like a minimum sort of income, even if you have two people on minimum income, you can't afford a property in Toronto. You need to rent a room because it's so unaffordable. So certainly that's one factor. But the bigger issue, I think, is that we need to be mindful of is that, in markets like Texas, like they've evolved in 20 years, right? 20 years ago, the people who were buying homes were probably people who lived in Texas, right? And had jobs in Texas. Today, houses have kind of shifted and you have a much stronger share of investors buying homes. And in the case of the US, a large number of institutional investors. I think in Texas, I think there's a report from the National Association of Realtors where in 2022, like institutional investors bought something like 25% of the homes that sold in a given year, like an unbelievably high number. So the challenge is that 30 years ago, 40 years ago, the only consumer of houses were the people who consumed housing, the people who had it as their principal residence as shelter, right? Today, you have two different groups of buyers, right? You have the consumers and you have investors. And yes, we had some investors in the past, but significantly bigger numbers. You didn't have corporations buying homes 20 years ago. It just wasn't possible for a number of reasons. So, you have two different groups of buyers, and the investors and the end users view homes very differently, value homes very differently, finance them very differently, and have different goals at the end of the day. And I think these different types of consumers who are now consuming homes is having a massive impact on affordability and in who can buy homes and who can afford them. So I think that is one big factor that I think some people are dismissing, but I think it's quite fundamental and structurally quite different from what we had even 20, 30 years ago.
Right. So if I return to my first analogy of a good that's necessity, like cars, let's use shoes as another example. Um, it is true that you could keep moving down the expensive sneaker line
Hmm.
until you can find a sneaker. But if you see people start investing in sneakers,
Hmm.
right? They're moving from buying a shoe as a
Yeah.
commodity that will depreciate in value as you
Hmm.
use it to
Exactly.
going on eBay, buying that, Michael Jordan, whatever shoe, but
Hmm.
investing in it, keeping it in a pristine box
Yeah.
so that its values climb,
Hmm.
right? Now
Exactly.
you can't afford that designer shoe. Now you've got to move down the substitution line.
Hmm.
But in the case of housing, the problem becomes more pernicious. As you
Hmm.
move down, you're talking about shared accommodations, people not moving out of their family homes,
Hmm.
even worse, unsafe conditions, kids unable to study properly in really
Hmm.
crowded homes. So it's sort of the two things together. Not only is there a hyper influx of demand,
Yeah.
as you try and substitute down the line, your choices have a really, I would say, outsides, extremely negative impact on your life, more
Yeah.
than not having the Michael Jordan designer shoe. Although when you're 13, that conclusion might be debatable. It might ruin your life in deleterious ways. But the point is that it's all coming together to equal a really, really pernicious problem.
Hmm.
and the kind that our economic theories aren't really up to solving.
Mhm.
Is that fair to
I
say?
agree 100%. I mean, that's what I find. I mean, I think if you just take this basic widgets, homes are just supply and demand, it doesn't explain everything that we see in our environments today. Again, like there's a massive inconsistency between what we're told should be happening in Texas, what is actually happening in a state like Texas that allows lots of supply, right? There are many inconsistencies with what we're told should be going on. So I think that is certainly one of the challenges.
So, if looking at housing as sort of this bloodless economic market that just needs to be allocated efficiently isn't the
Mhm.
answer, then how do we go about approaching this problem? What do you suggest?
Well, I think it's hard to, but I think before we talk about
Well, yes.
suggestions,
Sorry, actually, sorry, I'm going to interrupt myself.
go.
First, before getting off of why you suggest it, what
Mhm.
you suggest, we've just acted like we've just disabused this notion that
Mhm.
economics can solve housing.
Okay.
I want to make it clear that is not what our politicians are campaigning about.
Mhm.
We're seeing a lot of election cycles happening. First of all, I want to back up and say, why are we so married to this idea that economics is going to solve it? And every time it seems like the formula doesn't work, we throw something else at it. Oh, it's because we had gatekeepers.
Yeah.
Oh, it's because we need more zoning.
Yeah. I think,
Like,
I
why do
think,
we want it to be the solution? Why do we
I'll,
want it to be an economic problem?
I'll tell you why. I think, and again, I think this is where, for the longest time, I mean, I've been writing about housing for a long time, and at some point, I don't know when, like a couple years ago, as I'm writing about policy and on Twitter and different platforms, you hear other people talking about housing. And at some point, I'm like, yeah, okay, everyone wants housing to be affordable, right? And why do I not agree with this person at all? Like, why are our views so divergent, right? And it kind of led me to really think about, the topic of this show that we're kind of getting to is, what I call the politics of housing, because we do not think of housing policies as political issues, as issues that are rooted in one's political ideology. We just think of them as economic, and economic you think is just unbiased. It is neutral. It's just supply and demand, but it's not neutral. It is fundamentally political. And, to unpack what I mean, like, I think the best analogy is healthcare. You know, Canadians and Americans, in theory, their leaders all want healthcare to be accessible and affordable, right? But yet we have two fundamentally different systems in Canada and in the US. In the US, it's largely a privatized system that's funded by private insurance. And if you don't have that, you're going to have a hard time getting healthcare in the US. And then, of course, in Canada, we have a universal state funded healthcare system that sure has its issues. But the point is that healthcare should be free for all, right? And not a function of your means, how much money you make. Everyone should have access to this same healthcare, right? So fundamentally different ideas. Now, if we had economists come out, healthcare economists, and say, well, you know what? Canada's got some challenges with its healthcare system. We think the solution is we just need to privatize healthcare more. We got to take our hospitals, sell them to a lot of the corporations in the US. They're going to ramp up more money, build more supply, build more hospitals, build more testing facilities, bring more MRIs. It's going to be a for profit business. But if you prioritize the free market, it will flood so much capital and healthcare supply of services. Eventually, we'll be better off as Canadians. Okay. Now, if someone was to tell you that, you would instantly understand that they're basically trying to take a very American idea and system and apply it to Canada. They're trying to use sort of this free market approach, put capital and profit ahead of the universal access to healthcare that Canadians all have today, right? So be very clear what political spectrum, what side of the spectrum you're on, right? And yet when you hear politicians and economists and housing advocates make the same argument about housing, that the solution, we just need to make it more profitable for builders. We need to just make sure investors can buy more of our housing stock. We shouldn't interfere with the free market. We need more free markets. We need investors to buy more of our homes. You have CMHC saying it's not a problem that 100,000 homes are permanently being used as Airbnbs, and we shouldn't do anything in the way of investors converting homes to Airbnb because we value the free market and we want more investors to contribute to more supply. We don't think of that as rooted in any political ideology for some odd reason, but it is fundamentally rooted in a political ideology. All of these, supply advocates are not just advocating for more supply. They're not just about free markets on supply. They're actually free markets on everything, on the demand side. That's why many of them are against restrictions on Airbnbs, restrictions on foreign investors, restrictions on vacant homes. They're against rent control. They're free market everything, effectively, most of them, right? And yet we don't realize that over the past 10 plus years, the narrative in Canada has been trying to take houses that used to be shelter for Canadians into this privatized American style approach that makes them a business, right? And we're just sitting back and allowing this transformation to happen unquestioned, right? Because again, people think of it as just widgets like economics, supply and demand, and it is not supply and demand. It is highly political. It is rooted in political ideology, and one's political ideology shapes how we view the problem, how we think about the prescriptions for the problem, and our desired end outcome, okay? And the privatized housing supply people are getting their income. More of our homes are being used as financial assets. Canada's home ownership rate is falling because fewer households can afford a home. More and more investors are buying homes. And again, if this is the world Canadians want, this converting our homes into a business, effectively doing what Americans are into healthcare and kind of applying it to housing in Canada, that's the path we're on, right? And I think this is the disconnect a lot of people don't have. They don't view housing as being political, and it is extremely political. And I think we need to change how we think about it.
Boom. That's quite the analogy. Yes. Yes.
Does that make sense? Or am I like,
yes, actually, healthcare is on that hierarchy of needs, right? An essential human good. And, up there with shelter costs, out of shelter. So a really good comparable, right? There's not a lot of substitution that you can do if you need a drug to stay alive, right? There's generic and then there's the next guy. And, so some of the same kind of issues that we see in housing. And yet, whereas Canada, many other countries, Australia, the UK, countries across Europe have gone towards a universal healthcare system, right? In some shape or form in recognition of that human need. There is this other model of the free market solution. And it's interesting that where that divide, I think some of us wear it as a badge of honor and pride that our country has universal health care.
Yeah.
And how silly you are over there. That same kind of thinking doesn't apply to housing, where somehow maybe we've just been so conditioned to think it's just this neutral problem. It's a numbers problem.
Yeah.
Right. But it's absent that underlying problem or recognition of the nature of that commodity as being a human necessity.
Yeah, I think the problem is, number one, is certainly the framing of it as a neutral economic problem is kind of misleading the public. The other issue is, of course, a lot of people are benefiting from houses as a business, right? I mean, a lot of people have benefited from the growth in house prices, and the few that are accumulating lots of houses are actually benefiting from it, right? And we got to keep that in mind. This isn't the housing crisis is for Canada is not for people who own a single family home. They've been doing relatively well. It's for people who cannot, who can't afford a home and want a home, are forced to relocate out of province, out of country to have a home of their own. because they don't want the instability of renting and raising a family in a home, and we don't have many of them. So again, I think there are a lot of challenges facing Canada, but certainly this framing about housing, I think, is a big issue that we need to revisit.
Sure. I mean, like as I said, some of us like to look down on America for not having universal healthcare system. Well, a lot of people in Europe, in which housing is considered more of a right,
Hmm.
one that many governments across Europe, even in cities as expensive as Paris, continually look to supply a certain percentage of affordable housing at a much higher rate,
Hmm.
not only for those without means, but middle market people. We see that across Europe. I mean, they could look at Canadians and think, how can you treat this like a casino, an
Hmm.
investment scheme,
Hmm.
when so many people are being priced out of the market? And yet in Canada, John, my observation is we've changed
Hmm.
as a nation. We've all kind of become housing investors. It's not just big companies and
Hmm.
REITs and ways
Hmm.
to invest in it. It's, oh, buying that condo and that, or when you get married or move, not selling the condo
Yeah.
that you lived in when you were single and keeping it as an investment, right?
Hmm.
Or buying, working a hard job, but really labor intensive, but saving up to buy a bunch of rentals that you can rely on in your retirement. So
Yeah.
it seems to me that Canada has become a nation of investors and landlords,
We have 100%.
right?
Yeah.
And now, before we conclude, I assume that some changes happen. Now, it's not only that there's more demand for this kind of thing, but were there policy changes that allowed for us to invest in houses in this way? For example, why was it that several generations ago you would just buy the one house? Why didn't that widespread idea to invest in housing take off earlier, for example?
So, I mean, it's a good question, and there's a long answer to that. I mean, and I'm gonna publish a piece maybe over the next couple months that tries to unpack this because this didn't happen overnight. Like this was a gradual transition in Canada. It's not like all of a sudden we became a nation of investors. It is a number of policies put in place by governments more than 20 years ago that sort of led to this point, right? That effectively made houses the most lucrative financial asset, right? And over time, it shaped behavior. I mean, governments were kind of contributing to this, quite honestly. Ramping up our population growth, kind of causing prices to accelerate rapidly, made people feel like they need to buy a home for their newborn child. Otherwise, they're never going to be able to afford one when they're 25, right? So it shaped the psychology of the market. So the issue isn't so much like the individual investor, like some of them were just basically worried about a future for their kids, quite frankly, right? But it is this mindset and this shift in Canada, right? That certainly, and not just in Canada, in the US and in many developed countries, the shift of housing as an asset, as an investment that's causing home ownership rates to decline because more of them are going into the hands of wealthier investors, quite frankly, that is having a very big impact on the market. And again, the free market capitalist people will tell you that's not a problem. Part of it is because the economists should say, well, you should be indifferent between renting and owning in their economic utopia. You should be indifferent. I mean, obviously, again, as always, there's differences between the utopias our economists promise should exist versus what people actually want. So we're not indifferent. People wants to own their home, especially in North American countries. And I think, of course, as more homes are being basically kind of converted into investment properties, there's actually fewer of them available to be purchased, right?
Mhm.
And I think this is having a massive impact, not just in Canada, like I said, in many kind of developed countries around the world.
Right. And I mean, to push back on that idea of everything being, again, substitutable, you're neutral. It's not the case. Study after study shows that wealth gains by those who own in Canada is much higher than renters.
Hmm.
So that's one reason to have a preference, not just
Hmm.
psychological. But other studies, of course, if you're living in smaller and smaller condos and can't study very well as a
Hmm.
child, or you live in more and more precarious neighborhoods,
Hmm.
because that's where you can afford to live,
Hmm.
that is not a neutral substitution you're making, going back to that point.
Yeah,
You know,
100%.
so it has a huge outside impact on how you live. And so, yes, I definitely don't blame the average Canadian. I look forward to learning more as to how we got here. I certainly don't blame every single parent who's now wondering if it's instead of saving up for college degree
Hmm.
starting now for their newborn, they should
Hmm.
just buy them a house fund
Yeah.
because, quite frankly, most of our job income
Hmm.
raises didn't keep up with house appreciation.
They
And those
didn't.
of us that went out and got a lot of degrees
Mhm.
aren't doing that great relative to those of us who went out and got a lot of houses.
It's true. And I think that exactly that's a huge freaking problem, right? It's a
So
massive problem.
yeah, so forget the RSP.
Mhm.
Now it's the, I don't know, or the, sorry, the Registered Education Fund.
Yeah.
You know, now just do a tax-free savings house fund for your
Yeah.
newborn. I get it.
100%. Yeah.
So look forward to hearing more about your ideas in depth. I really enjoyed this situation. John, you got political. You're going to
I,
get some comments.
I did. I mean, listen, I think, I'm going to get some pushback. Some people are going to disagree. But listen, at the end of the day, and you know what? And to wrap up, like you had asked me earlier what I think a better path is, right? And there's no easy answer, right? But, if we think about my political ideology, obviously it shapes how I view housing. It's fundamentally different from the housing supply economists and the housing supply advocates who just talk about free markets. We have very different views. So that is a very, like I said, American privatized what they've done to US healthcare to do to housing in Canada. I don't kind of subscribe to that worldview. I tend to take a similar view to how Canada approaches healthcare, right? And the state intervenes to make healthcare accessible and affordable for all, right? And I think we need to take a very similar view to housing. If we want housing to be affordable, if we want it to be equal, if we want houses to be distributed across the many rather than the few over the next 10 years, there's the only way you can do it. If you're just letting the free market advocates kind of dictate what's going, we're kind of going towards, this neo-feudalism where only the wealthy will own and we'll have to rent from them. And that's the path that they're taking us on. We think about the end goal, the end vision, whether they admit or not, that's where the road we're going down, right? And I don't think it's a great one. I think the only way is to kind of take a very similar approach as we take to healthcare to housing. And I think this would be a massive shift, obviously, because Canadians over the past 15 years have learned to think about houses as a business, as an investment. I think it would be easier to do now because fewer Canadians think of houses as an investment, but that's a short-term phenomenon, right? Even after the US housing crisis, the bubble, I mean, Robert Shiller, who's like Nobel Prize in economics, basically came out and said, this whole people investing in houses, I mean, this is a short-term trend. I don't see that coming back anytime soon. And he said that in like 2013. And of course, it did come back and even stronger, right? So the fact that things have slowed down now does not mean no one's going to want to invest in housing in the future. Of course they will. So how do we set ourselves up for a better future? And I don't think the free markets is the way because this is the path we're on. And I don't think it's leading to equitable outcomes, I'd say.
Certainly. I mean, when a plague hit the world, a lot of us in Canada decided to just go out and buy houses. Just
100% around the world, actually, not
in
just Canada.
our response to not having any jobs and no work or ability to do anything was to buy a house. So
Exactly.
yes, I think actually you're giving us a lot to think about. Viewers and listeners, please share your comments. John is on X Twitter at John Pasalis. The show is at Move Smartly. You can see more contact details for us in our show notes. John, we're going to listen to more. If you have your opposing viewpoints, please share them with us. And we look forward to inviting over this year series of guests and other experts to talk about different aspects of the issues that John has raised, different perspectives from different countries, and to see what whether we can broaden out the dialogue. You've said some almost radical things here,
I think
thinking
so
about
for
Canadian
Canadian.
housing like healthcare. So fascinating.
We'll see what the comments are like.
Yes, yes, for sure. All right. So thanks to everyone for listening and viewing, and we will be back same time, same channel soon with our next segment. Thank you, everyone.